So now we are in part two of chapter 8 on social class. So now we're going to start off by kind of having a discussion about, to what extent do social classes really matter? And then we're going to talk about the kind of consequences of social class or inequality. And then we are going to focus closely on one social class that definitely matters, and that is the poor. And we'll end this presentation with a discussion of different types of explanations that people can offer as to why the poor are poor. So, beginning with this kind of question that while it's clear that inequality matters, do social classes themselves actually matter in a class system? So we know that the fact that people have differing amounts of resources is going to impact their life. But that's not necessarily the same thing as saying that your social class itself necessarily is significant. And part of, for people that wonder how significant your actual social class actually is, one thing that they kind of point to as a contributing factor when they suggest that it's maybe not as important as we think is that, especially in a person's lifetime, they can experience both intra-generational as well as intergenerational mobility. So they themselves move up or fall down a couple of rungs, or they move up and fall down a couple of rungs when compared to their parents or their grandparents. And this is especially true of the classes in the middle, right? The working class, the lower middle class, and the upper middle class. And so the fact that at any kind of given period in your life you can be in a different class has some people kind of questioning the overall significance of this kind of social class typology. And this is further kind of strengthened, this kind of attitude that social class doesn't really matter in America is further strengthened by the fact that America has the appearance of largely classlessness. Like, so obviously we can look at a homeless person or a millionaire that has a private jet and we can kind of see their social class. But once again, for the bulk of Americans that fall in those middle class groups, are we in some ways distinguishable from one another? Do we have these distinct life-defining experiences that the definition of social class says that we should have? And in a lot of ways we don't anymore to the same extent because of all the ways in which the lines have become blurred due to financing, due to credit cards, due to payment plans and layaways. I mean, the fact of the matter is if you're willing to have a high monthly payment, you can drive a fancier car than one would expect for your social class. If you carry around a lot of credit card debt, you might be wearing red bottom shoes and carrying Louis Vuitton bags and wearing designer jeans. You can give your child that all expenses included trip to Disney World, if you're willing to be on a payment plan and make payments on it. So, the things that perhaps would have made the classes a lot more distinct 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, a lot of those lines have been blurred. And so, in a lot of ways, the argument that social classes in America have distinct lifestyles and therefore distinct consequences based on those lifestyles is kind of not true. But that's not the same thing as saying that there aren't any consequences to inequality. So inequality exists beyond this concept of social classes. So there are consequences to the unequal distribution of important resources, income, assets, safe neighborhoods, higher education. And one way we can think about those consequences is by considering the term life chances. And these are either the opportunities or obstacles that one encounters in regards to education, social life, work, and other areas critical to social mobility. And this can be influenced by social class or even kind of of more accurately social inequality. And you can kind of just think through all the ways in which unequal access to certain resources impacts a person's access to education, their physical health, their mental health, their family life. So we know that, some types of people are more likely to get married, they're more likely to get divorced, they're more likely to be single parents. Their housing, the quality of the housing, the quality of the neighborhood, the number of people living within the house. Even things that we may not necessarily think of as being rooted in inequality or social class, like religion or politics, or the judicial system. People that study this can show that there are these differences where, poorer people have different kind of religious beliefs and religious attendance participation rates than wealthier people. Certainly, as indicated in the last presentation when talking about power, in politics, the wealthier do have more power due to their ability to write larger checks to candidates, and to organizations that are kind of used to somewhat influence candidates' stance on different topics. And then certainly in the judicial system, whether or not you have a private attorney versus a public defender, how you are perceived in terms of whether or not you're seen as being a contributing member of society or not. All of these things can kind of factor into, your likelihood of getting arrested, your likelihood of getting arraigned, your likelihood of getting indicted. And people who study this largely use empirical evidence to support those arguments. So for the next couple of slides, I just kind of want to briefly touch on some of these findings that are depicted in graphical form. So one consequence of inequality is education. There's oftentimes an achievement gap within the social classes where the higher your social class or the more resources you have, the higher your level of achievement. And then the opposite being true of people of the lower class. And so the resulting factor of this is that sometimes there is a cumulative disadvantage for lower classes, that if you're born into a lower class, if you're born into a family with less resources, usually you're raised by parents that are less able to help equip you with the educational skills that you might would need to do well in school. But then you're also more likely to go to schools that are poorly funded, and so they don't necessarily help you as much as they possibly could when it comes to gaining educational capital. And then when you get out of those schools, even if you are a strong student or very motivated, you might find that the cost of colleges or certain types of colleges might prohibit you from attending, or if you do attend, you might be forced to work part-time, and that impacts your likelihood of success. So all of this is considered a cumulative disadvantage in the sense that the disadvantages build upon one another. And so what you see here is the BA completion rate among three socioeconomic groups, the lowest quartile, second quartile, and the third quartile. And what it says is that based on their math test scores, whether or not they were low, middle, or high, what is the relationship between all three of these two factors in regards to BA completion rate? So it's worth noting that if you have low test scores, but you come from the highest quartile, you still have a pretty good chance of finishing college at 41%. But even if you have high test scores, but you come from the lowest quartile, you have a 21% chance of finishing college, which suggests, of course, that it's not ability, it's not something like individual merit. It's like, what could be those factors that are coming into play that make high achieving, low income students not complete college? And so this is the type of consequence of inequality that scholars are really interested in. And because a lot of schools, of course, use SAT scores as a way to determine which students get admittance in the first place, the kind of relationship that exists between parental earnings and SAT scores also comes into question. Is it just because they produce students that are better equipped to take the SAT? They're just smarter? Or is it more complicated than that? Does it have to do with their ability to pay for private tutoring or to pay for their student to take the test multiple times if they don't do as well? Because if that was the case, then it would be less about individual merit and more about parental resources. There are also consequences of inequality as related to health. Unsurprisingly, when you look at the life expectancy for men, the life expectancy for rich men exceeds the life expectancy for poor men by over a decade. And if you just think about health and social problems in general, the states that have a higher amount of income inequality, a lot of those states have worse health and social problems in those states. So you see kind of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana up there at the top. They have a high amount of income inequality, and they also seem to have a high amount of health and social problems that exist in their in their state. A lot of states that have lower income inequality have, in general, kind of better health and social problems. And your book is just kind of raises some questions about, how living in a state with a lot of inequality, how that might contribute to things like social stress and feeling, that kind of the consequences of working a job where maybe you have low prestige or low status, and how that might impact your health behaviors in some type of way. And the kind of final slide here related to physical health just shows that, once again, people that make less money indicate that they have more difficulty with everyday physical activities. And this isn't surprising because other research shows that people that have lower incomes are more likely to have chronic diseases as well as have higher rates of disabilities, which obviously all of this just kind of builds into this idea of cumulative disadvantages, right? You have disadvantages across multiple sectors and they build over time. Ah, and same thing here, unsurprising with mental health, although, the very public cases of several celebrity suicides make it clear that no one is safe from experiencing mental health disorders. If just in general, if it's just feelings of sadness, hopelessness, or worthlessness, there does seem to be a correlation between how much money you have and to what extent you feel those things, and versus with people that have less money, feeling them, indicating that they feel sad, hopeless, worthless at higher rates than people that make more. And so, if you're picking up on kind of the theme here, that the greatest distinction tends to be between the people at the bottom and everyone else, that just kind of emphasizes the point that the poor, whether the working poor or the underclass, well, this is a social class that clearly matters, that definitely does share some life defining experiences that shape their lives in a multitude of ways. And so, before we get into the next few slides, which really just answers the questions who are the poor by providing information in the form of graphs, I want to give you a handful of terms related to poverty. And there are kind of three ways we can talk about measure poverty in sociology. We can talk about poverty in terms of absolute poverty. So this is a person that is experiencing the type of poverty where they cannot even meet their basic needs. Basic needs being things like food, housing, and shelter. So the best example of absolute poverty in modern societies is the homeless, of course, because this is a group of people whose poverty is such that their basic needs are not getting met. Another form of poverty that's a lot more subjective and therefore harder to measure, so we don't necessarily use this definition very often in sociology, is relative poverty. So this is you define yourself as poor, you feel poor in comparison to other people in your area. So, for instance, if you live in the type of area where there is limited mass transit and not a lot of sidewalks, and it's not pedestrian friendly, then not having a car in that type of place might be a sign of relative poverty. Um, in the last couple of years, as cell phones and laptops have become just more essential for day-to-day life, not having this type of technology, while not a basic need, is nevertheless considered a form of relative poverty because most people do. And you are certainly at a kind of cultural disadvantage, whether it's, doing your schoolwork at night, contacting, being able to contact and communicate with people if you don't have this form of technology. So that's relative poverty. But it's that type of poverty is very subjective and therefore makes it hard to measure. So in order to have a kind of more objective form of poverty, most of the time when we're talking about the poor, we're talking about the official poor or official poverty. And this is poverty that is defined by the poverty line. And the poverty line can exist at the federal level as well as the state level. And so the federal level is kind of the minimum level of poverty. But there are some states, like states that have like a high cost of living, like a California or New York, where because they know it's much more expensive to live in their state than the average state, they also establish their own kind of state poverty lines, which usually have kind of higher incomes associated with them than the ones that I'm about to go over. But this is the 2018 federal poverty line guidelines. And so the federal poverty line is based on an equation that was established during the 1960s. Using an equation based on the cost of like some basic foodstuffs, and how much it would cost to feed a household of that size, in kind of the correct amounts of food for those basic foodstuffs. And so for a household of one person, the federal poverty line is 12,490. For a household of two, 16,910. For the household of three, 21,330. And it goes on up to 8 people. And then it says that once you go over 8 people, it's an additional 4,420 for each additional person. So the thing to know about the poverty line, it is a hard and fast, rigid line. So and it's used to largely determine eligibility for federal, and in some cases state government assistance. And so if the federal guideline is set at you need to be at 100% of the poverty line, right? Meaning that's the amount of money that's in your household, then making $1, $2, $50 more, although that doesn't really dramatically change your lived experience, it does make you therefore ineligible for that form of government assistance. And this is part of why when we look at the poor, what usually distinguishes the working poor from the poor is the working poor is usually not eligible for most forms of government assistance because they do go to work, and while they do not make a lot of money, they usually make just enough that they are above the poverty line. So when we come to the next presentation, when we talk about government assistance and the social safety net, that is something to consider, is that for a lot of programs, it's based around these type of eligibility criteria. And some of these are extremely low, $16,910. If you are a single mother or father with a dependent child, that is a very poor household. But if you make $17,000, you are still a poor household, but you are now potentially a poor household that isn't eligible for these government assistance programs. So the next few slides are really just asking the question, who are the poor in the United States? And it's asking that question and providing the answer in graphical form. So first of all, just know that when we look at all of the U.S. poor, that 44% of the poor are white Americans, 22% are African Americans, 28% are Latinos, 4% are Asian Americans, and 2% are Native Americans. Kind of like what we were discussing when I was going over the prison populations. In order for this information to make sense, you have to think about which group is under and overrepresented in terms of their percentage of the larger population. So whites are underrepresented, although they are the bulk of the American poor, given that they are about 64% of the population. There are less whites who are poor than what we would expect based on that number. Both Latinos and African Americans and Native Americans are overrepresented because in almost each case they're almost double their population. So 22% of African Americans are poor, but they're only 13% of the population. 28% of Latinos are poor, but once again, they're only 16% of the population. And Native Americans, 2%, they make up 2% of the poor, while they're only 1% of the population. Asian Americans are roughly almost at parity. They're about 5% of the population, and they're 4% of the impoverished. Where we find poor people, or which states have the highest density of poor people, also changes. The states that are in the teal are the states that have the most poverty. A lot of those states are in the South, as well as kind of trickling into the Southwest. States that are in the orange have kind of an average amount of poverty, and the states that are purple have the least poverty. Because we are living here in North Carolina, and it is one of the states that has a higher amount of poverty, trying to understand why do we have more poor people in our state than other states, is a question that maybe a sociologist would be interested in and would like to know the answer to. As already discussed, we can kind of look at which racial ethnic groups are over and overrepresented in terms of their poverty rates. And we can also then break this further apart in age. In general, both children and the elderly are vulnerable to being impoverished. In both cases, it has to do with the fact that, unlike working age adults, it's not very easy for them to address their impoverished state. Children, of course, are someone's dependents. So if they are born into a poor family, if their family is poor, there is very little that they can do as children to change that status. The elderly are slightly different. But at some point, whether you want to retire or your health forces you to retire, if you have not planned appropriately for retirement, you can find yourself living on a fixed income. And usually, if you are living on Social Security or disability, which a lot of elderly are, those payments are such that you are still considered to be part of the impoverished. And so, in almost all cases, you have a lot of impoverished elderly people across different racial and ethnic groups. There are educational implications to poverty, which, although, there are no promises in life, but what this graph should kind of clearly depict to you is that if you drop out of high school, you are dramatically increasing the likelihood that you're going to wind up poor versus graduating from college, which diminishes the likelihood that you will wind up poor, right? You might wind up underemployed, and you might wind up maybe not making as much as you would hope, but the likelihood that you will actually be impoverished is much less likely than if you would have done something like dropped out of high school. The next couple of slides all deal with household structure, and they're meant to illustrate a concept called feminization of poverty, that poverty takes on a very gendered type of outcome, where households that are headed by women are just more likely to be poor. So what you're seeing here is that regardless of race, if you are in a household where there is a female householder, no husband, no partner present, you have much higher poverty rates than both married couple families as well as other types of families, all families, and that all families would include households where you have just a single father present. And if you think about this, this makes sense in light of what was discussed in the last presentation about the distinction between lowly paid pink collar jobs that are primarily held by women who lack higher educational credentials versus jobs that are blue collar, which are held by men that lack higher education credentials, but those jobs are more likely to be better compensated. And then, just in general, there is a correlation between the likelihood of being a single mother and not having higher education, and being a person with lower income, and being a single mother. So, when you look at who's most likely to become a single mother in our society, and then factor into that the fact that women are less likely to be as well paid as men, then it makes this finding that female headed households are more likely to be in poverty than male headed households or married couple households. Well, it makes that finding make sense. And so, a final graph, which just goes back to this point about child poverty, is that in our country, child poverty is a problem in some states, much more so than others. So, in 2017, the state that had the highest level of child poverty is Louisiana, and that was 22.75. But there are other states that are also very high. You can see them in the darker green color. North Carolina is kind of there in the middle as a teal. And then there are states that have much lower child poverty rates. And of course, I think we'll talk about the significance of child poverty here in a second, but really, if you just think about what I've already said, that children are particularly vulnerable to being impoverished because there's so very little they can do to change that, right? They didn't get to choose their family, and they can't really change their family's household status in terms of income, not until they're adults themselves. And based on what we know about the impact of growing up impoverished, the concern for people who study child poverty is that it is hard for children to kind of escape this. Not impossible, but nevertheless very hard. And it raises just questions about, the fairness of this type of system. And so this brings me to kind of my final slide for this presentation. And this is where we're just kind of addressing, this question about why people are poor. Because when we get to the next presentation where we discuss how we should address poverty and how we should address income, wealth, inequality in general, people's attitudes about poverty in America and people's attitude about people in lower classes is very strongly correlated to their kind of support for what role they think the government should play in addressing poverty. And so there are kind of three kind of sets of explanations of poverty that sociologists put out there. Individual explanations, cultural explanations, and structural, social structure explanations. So, individual explanations. One of them is one that was a topic from like chapter 1, and I just want to remind you of it here. And that is Herbert Spencer's ideas in regards to social Darwinism. The idea that poor people are just not as good people, and therefore instead of being provided assistance programs, Herbert Spencer was a big believer that this just allowed the weakest links in society to kind of survive, and that we were doing them no favors by providing this type of assistance. That in the same way, under Darwinism, right, that only the strong should survive. In social Darwinism, it is pretty much the same viewpoint, right, that only the strong people should survive. And in this case, the poor are not considered to be strong people. There are very few people out there nowadays necessarily saying we should let the poor just die on the streets. That's a very extreme individualistic explanation. Instead, the much more common individualistic explanation of why people are poor is what your book kind of calls like blaming the victim style explanations, where you kind of point to people's individual failings, habits, behaviors as a reason as to why they're poor. So you maybe have heard people give these types of explanations, right? If they worked harder, if they hadn't have dropped out of school, if they would have waited until they were married to have children, all of these are blame the victim style poverty arguments. If it's the type of argument that specifically suggests something like the poor would be less poor if they made better financial decisions, if they didn't waste their money on frivolous things, if they ate out less, if they saved more, then this relates closely to what your book says about beliefs Americans have about deferred gratification, and what we feel like is a strong correlation between deferred gratification and social class or social mobility. As your book notes, a lot of social science research doesn't really support this. Like there are plenty of middle class people out there making bad decisions about their money, and certainly the wealthy also make bad decisions about their money as well. The difference being, of course, is if you don't have a lot of money, then making these decisions has a much greater impact and consequences than if you do have a lot of money. Where, if you lose millions of dollars but you're a billionaire, that's not really a problem, or that's not necessarily going to destroy your life. If you live in a household where you count every dollar, every single penny, then yes, there is this sense that deciding to buy, a $10 meal out versus using that $10 to make a pot of spaghetti that you eat off of all week would be the difference between you getting ahead and not getting ahead. But like I suggested, a lot of the actual empirical evidence around this is not as strong as one would think. This is one of those examples of where kind of our common sense understanding of a situation doesn't really perfectly align with what research suggests. Unsurprisingly, in a discipline like sociology, where we're less interested in individualistic explanations, means that we don't use individualistic explanations of poverty very often. Instead, we prefer to talk about it as a group, like, right, 20% of our United States population is in the bottom quartile. 15% of them are the working poor. 5% of them are the underclass. Could it really be because 20% of our country's population, make bad decisions and have brought it upon themselves? Sociologists just find this unlikely. So instead, we're interested in kind of larger social explanations for this kind of distribution of resources. And so one set of larger macro sociological explanations focuses on culture, and we call this cultural explanations, or more specifically, we call it the culture of poverty argument. And this was created by a sociologist by the name of Oscar Lewis, and he wrote in his book, where he discussed this theory, that responses of poverty become well and entrenched cultural traits that pass from one generation to the next. So basically, what he's saying is it's not like the DNA of the poor people that make them poor, which is kind of Herbert Spencer's point, but the idea that they raise their children, they socialize them, they role model beliefs, values, and behaviors that can contribute to them perhaps remaining poor. So this goes back to spending decisions. It goes back to, maybe behavior in school, the value placed on education, the value of hard work, maybe how people are taught to interact with people in authority. But just the idea that if your parents are poor, did they maybe teach you cultural values, beliefs, norms that make it more likely you're going to remain poor versus whether or not you will experience mobility. And kind of the opposite of this is cultural capital. Middle class, upper class families, they pass along to their children cultural capital. This is the knowledge, the skills, that people can use, the cultural knowledge, the cultural skills, in order to fit in with the higher classes and to get ahead. So this would include everything from etiquette to knowledge of things like, fine art, what we call the literary canon, your vocabulary. It can include things related to dress codes, right? So you know the difference between white tie, black tie, cocktail wear. All of these are examples of cultural capital. And this is what people that are in the upper middle, upper classes have versus culture of poverty, which is what Lewis would suggest that people in the lower classes have. The final set of explanations, which is probably the most popular among sociologists, a lot of sociologists either embrace the structural arguments or a combination of structural and cultural arguments, is these structural arguments, of which I am going to talk specifically about one that your book discusses, poverty triggers, and then I'm just going to kind of talk in general about the changes in capitalism, which is a focus in chapter 11, which we are not going to cover in this class, but you are welcome to read on your own. So structural arguments basically say that there are features of society that deny some people access to education or training and job skills. So the key part here is, instead of focusing on culture or instead of focusing on individuals, you're focusing on social institutions, and the fact that depending on your social class, we have different experiences with social institutions. So if you are born to a poor parent, you are more likely to grow up in a poor neighborhood versus a wealthier neighborhood. That neighborhood is more likely to experience crime. We know from research that those neighborhoods have slower emergency response times. They're less likely to have green spaces, which means less places for children to play safely outside. Neighbors are less likely to know one another in those types of neighborhoods, which is important if you're raising children, because that means you can't necessarily count on your neighbor to watch out for your child. Because in most places, your neighborhood is what factors into what school you go into. If you grow up in a poor neighborhood, you're more likely to go to a poor school. Poor schools have less resources. They have less qualified teachers. They have less active PTAs. They offer a smaller range of clubs and activities, all of which can increase students' investment in education. They often have lower high school graduation rates, and they send less children to college. And we do know that growing up or being surrounded by peers who are headed to college does positively influence students' likelihood of going to college themselves. So all of those are just features of society where, depending on if you're born to a poorer family or a richer family, your experiences with those social institutions can be radically different. Another structural element is poverty triggers, which is the idea that sometimes things happen. Your family gets evicted. There's a medical emergency. Your job shuts down. You lose your job. those are the types of things that can trigger poverty among families that are living right above the poverty line. Working class families, in some cases, maybe even a lower middle class family, can fall into poverty if they experience a poverty trigger. And the final thing has to do with capitalism. So, the goal of capitalism, where you have individuals owning the means of production, is to make a profit. And when America's heyday, what we often saw, and this is what you see here when you have the peddler, plumber, professional, is that a lot of immigrants, European immigrants to America, did not come in wealthy or with a lot. They came in, all they really had was the willingness to work with their own two hands, and we call that the peddler generation. The modern day version of that might be the migrant farm worker generation. But they came to America. They worked hard, and more importantly, when they had a child, their child was an American citizen and therefore got to benefit from schools and other such opportunities. So, in that second generation, the plumber generation, you have children that, although they maybe were not ready to go to college, both in terms of skill, motivation, as well as resources, they were able to establish a solidly lower middle class career in the trades. And then when they had their children, this was the generation that was most likely to then go on to college and achieve some type of professional status and be upper middle class. And so we call this the three generation model of success. And it's worth noting that a lot of European Americans, this is the model that they experienced. It has a lot to do with when they entered into America and how the economy was doing during that time. What has happened beginning in the 60s and escalating in the 70s and the 80s is that deindustrialization has made that second rung, that plumber, blue collar rung, a lot shakier, because now there are decreasing opportunities for people to have a middle class lifestyle without necessarily going to college. And this is especially true, of course, for unmarried women, as we talked about with the pink collar jobs and the feminization of poverty. And this means it is a lot easier for some families to become stuck at that rung. So instead of there being a three generation model for success, it's now taking some immigrant families 4 to 5 generations, because they are having to kind of either quickly propel themselves, their children, to be college ready, or they kind of get stuck on that middle rung as they have the jobs that are not very highly paid, that kind of keep them stuck in this cycle. And so that's it for presentation number 2 on social class. For the third presentation, the final presentation, the focus is going to kind of be on where are we going in the future, and what role, if any, should the government play in addressing inequality.